Hello, I'm Seán ó Conlaín, agus tá fáilte roiid go léir aniu go dtí an webinar seo. For those of you who don't know me, I have a particular interest in the topic. I'm a farmer, a forester, a former Feasta trustee, all the F's together. And I'm also involved in a global project with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. In Ireland, we have a hub, and we are endeavouring to create a new social imaginary for Ireland on the island of Ireland. Caroline asked me to mention what Feasta is about for those of you who don't know Feasta. Feasta brings together a number of approaches, I suppose you might call them, or perspectives. There's a systems thinking perspective. There's a holistic approach to addressing problems. And underpinning all of that is our approach to ecological sustainability. The strapline Feasta uses is the foundation for the economics of sustainability. But fundamentally, Feasta is about the creation of new ideas and the dissemination of those ideas. So today we're actually witnessing all of, if you like, all of that perspective and Feasta's work in action. Agriculture in Ireland is, if it's not at a crossroads, it's certainly at some kind of conflux of issues and challenges. There's the crisis of the past policies, the legacy policies about almost like a mono-expansionist approach to agriculture. And then there are the bigger challenges of climate and the policies around that, of carbon capturing, sequestration of soil, degradation of biodiversity collapse. And then we add on top of that, on a daily basis, we hear of further challenges coming from the Ukraine and Russia and the impact of what's going on there. So we're very fortunate that Caroline White, an ecological economist, has produced this paper for us. And she has created what are potentially very new perspectives, I think. I like to quote one of my favorite songwriters and singers, Leonard Cohen, about Caroline bringing us some light through the cracks. She is questioning all of the underlying assumptions, I think, the economic and ecological assumptions, to a certain extent, what you might call the agricultural gospel to date. So these are being questioned. And she's aptly called this moving the goalposts. So we'll see if we can move the goalposts today. So our task is to look at what Caroline has put before us, to get your initial reactions to what she is proposing in her paper, and also in particular those who have volunteered to speak. So there is, of course, the challenge of time. We don't have a huge amount of time. Certainly we could spend days discussing this, but we just have 1 hour and a half. That's it. So I would encourage you to use the chat as much as you can. It's a little bit distracting, but please go for it. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to use Mentimeter to give us your overall comments. And of course, after the event, we would encourage you and invite you to communicate with us through email. So the structure for today is we'll have a brief introduction from Caroline about her paper, and then we're going to look at each of the 3 sections that she has divided the paper into. Caroline will mention these in a few minutes. And there'll be inputs for each of those sections by our volunteer speakers, if you like, an array of them. So we're looking forward to it. And then we'll have some comments at the end, drawing it together, and hopefully our objective is to look at what the next steps are and to get your feedback on what that should be. I'd like to finally mention that on the May the 18th, there's a further opportunity when we will incorporate the feedback from today and some other feedback into this ongoing project, and there would be most likely a revised edition of the paper for that. So I'll hand you back now to Caroline, and tá fáilte rud go léir ríist.
So basically this paper came about because, as Seán mentioned, I have a background in ecological economics, and I'm just going to very quickly share my screen just for a minute, because ecological economics is kind of what's the, more or less, basically it's a different way of looking at the economy from a more sort of traditional way of looking at the economy. So basically we would consider the environment to be a kind of non-negotiable aspect of the world that we're in now, and that's because we're hitting against environmental limits, and they're quite scary in a lot of ways. We actually really need to make very radical changes in the economy to make sure they fit within those limits. And so this, if you like, it's not just a question of pricing things correctly, it's also a question of really using regulation and quite strong measures to try and make sure that the economy fits within the limits. And the challenge with that is that, of course, generally speaking, you know, the way we think about the economy, the way we're encouraged to think about it, is that you have to keep increasing production, you have to keep expanding production in order to make sure everybody gets what they need. And if you don't do that, then you're going to run into really serious problems. You're going to run into death, unemployment, all kinds of businesses going bankrupt, all kinds of things like that. And unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but the evidence shows that, in fact, it's very, very hard to reconcile the way things are set up right now. It's very hard to reconcile a shrinking or a non-growing economy with environmental protection. It's just extremely hard. I mean, there's been loads of attempts to do it, to decouple, as they call it, damage from GDP growth, damage to the environment from GDP growth, but it's not working very well so far. So another way to look at it is to try and find ways to fit the economy within the environmental limits, but also to make sure that social needs are met. And this is the economic donut, which is very famous now. It was created by an economist called Kate Raworth. And basically her idea is that we have to find a way to be in a state of dynamic balance where we meet all our social needs, everybody gets what they need in terms of food, housing, community, all of the good things in life, but you're not compromising environmental limits. And so how can we manage that? How can we achieve that kind of balance? So I was in Feasta, we have a theory of change. I'm not going to read all of this out now, and it's probably too small to read, but basically the idea is that there are various things that are needed and they're all interconnected. If you take one of them away, other things might fall over. So that's why we have three, if you see there's three little plants there holding up the donut. And so there's an interdependency there. And in this paper, I'm looking at some of these measures that we have in the theory of change. And just one last slide, and I'm going to actually pass on to other people because I think it's better to have other voices commenting on the main gist of this paper. But basically in the paper, I'm looking at various measures, and I wanted to get across an idea of movement, you know, in the economy. So I've had a great help from a graphic designer called Leontine Friel-Darrell, and we came up with this idea of a bicycle because a bicycle is balanced, but it's got all these components that are necessary to keep it balanced and keep it moving. And so we're going to be talking about some of these things that are mentioned here in this diagram. And we're going to start off with universal basic income and social wage, and then we move on to taxation reform and debt restructuring. But first of all, we're going to hear from a few people who have some very sort of general comments about the paper, and they might hone in on some of these particular ideas as well. So the first person I'm going to hear from is Dr. Ollie Moore. Delighted to have you, Ollie. Ollie's the Communications Director and Editor-in-Chief with the Agriculture and Rural Convention, or ARC 2020, which is a network of agriculture and rural actors working together for good food, good farming, and better rural policies in the EU. So I'll stop sharing now and we'll hand over to Ollie.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for that intro. And also, I'm here in Clough-Jordan Eco Village, and I also work part-time with Cultivate. And I'm in UCC Centre for Cooperative Studies, where I also teach on a master's programme on cooperatives, agri-food and sustainable development. So yeah, thanks Caroline for the paper. I had good fun delving into it. It was, some of it is relatively new to me. So there's some areas that I'm starting to explore more, and some areas I feel I'm okay on, and I can see the potential for synergies between, you know, some of these CAP areas and how agricultural policy is progressing, and some of the ideas in this paper. Also, just to mention that the CAP observation letters were published today publicly. So what Ireland is telling the European Commission, it's Ireland's, the Department of Agriculture's opinion on the European Commission's opinion on Ireland's CAP plan has been made public today. So that's available on the department, on the European Commission's website and on Twitter and so on. So yeah, so I suppose I have five basic little points to make in response to Caroline's paper. I'm going to presume people have read it and heard what Caroline said there now as well. So there was a point on moving past GDP and productivist agriculture. So in terms of finding interesting and fruitful places to look for where that's happening to an extent, I think some recent moves in Germany and in England are worth looking at on that. And I'm saying England specifically, not just like Irish shorthand. It's like England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland do have different administrative approaches to agri-food and rural. So they each do things in different ways at different times. But one of the things that happened with Brexit, and it's one of the things which isn't so bad about Brexit, is they were able to move away from CAP and move away from the basic payment system, actually based on historical productivity, 20 years ago, more or less now. So because of that, there are new environmental land management schemes coming in, and these are ostensibly about public money for public goods. So they have actually started to move away from the baseline that CAP works from. Now, the reality of that is only starting to unfold. The first schemes are really just coming out in June or July. But I think in terms of trying to get to grips with how something approaching moving away from a baseline in productivist agriculture, I think seeing how that pans out and looking at organisations like Sustain in the UK and what their interpretation is of that will be interesting and fruitful. We have an article from James Woodward and Vicky Hurd on the ARC website about that, and we'll keep getting updates over time as well. And in Germany as well, there's a Green Agriculture Minister, and it does as well look like they're going to start trialling something that moves beyond the CAP baseline in Germany as well. So as the years unfold, we'll see things in those two countries potentially which are relatable. So ostensibly more about public goods, but yeah. So another thing as well that could be interesting to look at, moving from productivity to value capture has potential too as well. So the position and profitability and value share of farmers and rural communities in the chain from production to distribution to consumption to waste. How much do farmers get in that? And I know Alan Matthews is on the call here, and Alan and Matteo Meta from ARC did have stuff in our document last year on this point, our Feeding Ourselves document 2021, where it's just trying to figure out exactly what's going on in terms of value capture and exports and so on. But the basic point, I suppose, is that with change, there's often the point at which value is extracted changes as well. So, for example, when coffee pods came along, the amount that the producer got declined rapidly and quickly because this innovation was an excuse, really, as well, to move the value up the chain. And more towards the marketing and retail end. So looking at how we can move the value back towards the producer end is important. I think the fossil fuel economy, the ending of the fossil fuel economy will make the potential of the economy to be more diffuse, more real. So capping, as you mentioned, on nitrogen could work. I think we're seeing things in the dairy vision group which were unthinkable 6 months ago even, about quotas and ring fencing, and the ideas are coming from them, which is unusual and unexpected. We have a feed security rather than a food security crisis, but that pinch point will eventually have to come true. These pressures on feed and fuel and fertilizers and so on will possibly as well lead to maybe efficient collective actions. I live in hope, but in France there are 45,000 collectively owned farms owned by between 3 and 7 people, and machinery co-ops are the standard. So that's obviously a lot better. You had this thing in the paper you wrote for the paper we published, that you had an article in about labour intensive and job rich juxtapositions. I think organics is a strong case there. If you look at the EU biodiversity strategy, organics is better for labour, and an agroecological rural regionalisation could do that a lot as well. I don't feel like I'm an expert on UBI, but UBI and UBS combined makes a lot of sense. CAP could be seen as a UBI in a way, but the problem is the basic stuff, the monitoring, the evaluation, the clawbacks if stuff isn't done properly is just so weak that there's not a lot. It's a poor baseline to work from, I suppose. But and CSAs then, I suppose, community supported agriculture. I'm involved in a CSA here in Cloughjordan. That could be seen as a UBI for farmers and a UBS for community. One of the problems is there hasn't been much take up on CSAs in Ireland, but it's much stronger in some countries. So maybe comparing how some countries are doing quite well, like France and Italy to an extent with its gas system, and what worked and didn't work in places like Ireland then as well. But a CAP kind of is a funny one because it almost is like a basic income, and there are basic conditions, GAIACs as they're called. But the problem is they get weakened for years in negotiation, and then the inspection rate's about 5%. Whereas in organics, it's 100%. Every farmer gets inspected once a year. Anyway, so I have micro notes as well I can send over to you, and I can tidy up this and send it across. But yeah, thanks for that. Sorry, I started a bit slow, but I got going.
Oh, no, you're grand. Thanks very much. That's all very useful, and I've jotted down notes. So I'm going to move on because I'm really sorry. I have such a packed schedule. I'm going to move on to Charles. So Charles Stanley Smith is one of two environmental pillar representatives on the Common Agricultural Policy Consultative Committee, and which was convened by the Irish Department of Agriculture. And Charles is also a member of Antashka, which, as you all know, is the National Trust for Ireland, and he's a member of Feasta. So thanks a lot, Charles. Take it away, please.
And also live in a rural village in Tipperary, so I'm, can't be accused of being an urbanite. And I grew up on a farm as well, a huge farm of 30 acres. But as that farm was in Jersey, 30 acres in Jersey is a very big farm. Anyhow, I like the paper. Oh yeah, one thing that to remember is another thing happening right now, which is a major problem. It's this heat wave in India and Pakistan, which is having a huge effect on their growth. They're growing because it's just too hot for a lot of their agriculture right now, and has been for the past week or two, and will be for a while. So they're going to lose quite a large proportion of their output, let alone all the strain and stress of trying to live in 50-degree temperatures at work. So that's this climate change is real. Just we all know that anyhow. But just to say, yeah, on the CAP, I'm involved in the future CAP, not the past CAP, and there are a few things changing in it. There's over the years they have tried to make CAP more environmentally focused, but as always, there's a fight back from farmers and so on. So what happens in Europe is a continuous fight between environmentalists trying to push environmental concerns and farmers trying to stop it. Even to the extent, as Ollie mentioned, the letter has been received from the Commission about Ireland's strategic plan, and it's got 170 different items in it. The CAP Consultative Committee has a meeting tomorrow, and myself and Una will be putting forward our response to those items, and we'll share it with you after tomorrow. But they also have written, the department has written to the Commission about these observations and how they promise to do more. But they're kind of relying on this thing is that what has happened over in Europe over the years, Caroline mentions the fact that the two original objectives of the CAP are still there in law, although the CAP has moved on since. They're also, this push now for the Green New Deal in Europe is being pushed, but actually none of the Green New Deal is actually in law. So the farmers are fighting back saying, yeah, we don't have to do that because it's not law. So there's a very major push, and Ireland seemed to be waving that flag in their response to the Commission. So we'll see how that all goes on. Just on, Ollie mentioned the fact that the way that the CAP, or that is now known as the BIS, the Basic Income Support for Sustainability, which is the common amount you get as a farmer from CAP, has been changed. You now only get 75% for just meeting the conditionalities. And these conditionalities are known as GAIACs. There's 8 or 9 of them, keep changing. And as Ollie says, that they're all right, but they're very seldom properly administered. But what they've done this time, and this is why you'll hear a lot of the farmers complaining, they've taken 25% of the basic income and put it into what are known as eco schemes. And you can earn extra, you can earn that 25% back by doing these what are meant to be environmental eco schemes. But some of them can be achieved by farmers for doing nothing. But there again, there is a huge difference in farmers, basically in the west and the east of the country. In the east of the country, it's mainly dairy farmers who earn considerable amounts of money and actually are not really particularly interested in CAP, and often don't even bother applying for CAP because it restricts them too much and too bureaucratic. Whereas the West Coast requires support from CAP, and these are where there's one particular eco scheme which West Coast farmers will just get because they achieve what is required anyhow. So there's no ambition in that. So just to say that the two things that also came up, which have not been dealt with by the Irish people in CAP. One is short supply chains, which are not, there is room in CAP for them, but they're not being discussed in Ireland. And the other is the whole area of local food and local food communities and all that, which again, fell on stony ground in Ireland. There was no wish to incorporate these measures, which could have been done, into the Irish CSP. So, and as Ollie says, they are trying within CAP to restrict the amount of chemical nitrogen, but it's only be about 20%, whereas it needs to be a lot more than 20%. So that's my sort of opening statement. Thanks very much.
That's great. Yes, very, very useful. Thanks. Okay, final beginning person. We've got Kieran Harrahill. He's a researcher on the rural economy, particularly the bioeconomy society interface in Ireland, and he'll be joining TASK, the think tank for action on social change, later this year to work on climate justice. Kieran, welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. And just to mention, I'm also from Tipperary as well. So we've got great representation here today. So I'm delighted to be representing TASK in this discussion today. The release of this paper by Feasta on the economics of agriculture, as the speakers have said, is highly timely because of the increased costs which farmers are facing, particularly with fertilizer prices as well as food and feed. The report also notes the power dynamics which are within the agriculture sector in terms of the value chain and the little power or influence which farmers have compared to processors or retailers. In a report published by the group Action Aid 3 years ago, the authors discussed how the industrialization of agriculture has led to the death of rural America. The current economic model of agriculture is unsustainable, both from an environmental perspective, but also in terms of the incomes which farmers are receiving. It is therefore excellent to see references to the work of my predecessor in TASK, Seán McCabe, on the people's transition. Central to this is moving towards a model of community wealth building. Not only has this the potential to enhance the positioning of farmers within value chains in the sector, but as mentioned by previous speakers, it could also help us to address wider societal issues such as food security, as well as the energy crisis we are currently facing. There is no doubt, however, that change does not come about easily. This is best described in a report from the National Economic and Social Council on addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland. This is a report which has been praised highly by President Michael D. Higgins. It describes how transitions are messy. The task of changing sectoral mindsets from one which is based on productivity towards one which is based on sustainability will be a challenge. From research which I have conducted as part of my PhD research study, I have identified a number of challenges or impediments which may hinder the ability of farmers to diversify. While some of these issues relate to logistical challenges, such as time constraints and the cost of farm diversification, another factor which is important to consider is identity. So as we are currently seeing today in debates surrounding the use of peat, if there is a failure to consider justice within the application of environmental policy, there is the potential that resistance will take place towards necessary climate measures. It is for this reason that social dialogue is crucial, whereby the voices of our farmers are considered within the development of environmental policies. A failure to consider the experiences, the ambitions, and the challenges which farmers face could lead to a scenario whereby resistance takes place and that the move away from the productive model of agriculture replicates debates which have occurred in other regions which have been dependent on fossil fuel employment for generations, whereby jobs and the environment are pitted against one another. To conclude, while emission creation in agriculture must undoubtedly be reduced, it must not be forgotten that, as was discussed by Sabrina Decker in her paper to the Climate Change Advisory Council, that farmers are also the victims of climate change. There is arguably no sector of the economy which will be impacted more by extreme weather events than the agricultural sector. It is therefore crucial to ensure that the voices of farmers are heard and that farmers are supported in the transition from the productivist model of agriculture, where they are placed on the margins of value chains, towards moving to a model which both protects the environment but also ensures that rural economies and rural areas are healthy and thriving. I therefore welcome this report by Feasta and hope that the recommendations within it are taken on board by decision makers.
Thank you very much, Kieran. That was really good and clear and very helpful. Because we are low on time, I'm going to actually go on to the next section, which is about universal basic income. But I think everybody, please feel free to make comments on what you've just heard in the chat, ask questions, and we can all just keep the dialogue going in the side as well. I'm also just going to paste the question in, which is a kind of general question, and please feel free to answer that as well. There we go, it's in. So now I'm just going to very quickly talk about the first section of the paper, which is universal basic income. Now that's already come up a bit, and I'm going to pass the baton on very quickly again. One thing I just want to clarify is that this isn't the same as cap direct payments. Universal basic income is an income that goes to everybody in the Irish economy, every resident of Ireland, and it's the same amount for every adult. So it's quite different from a payment system which varies according to how much eligible land you have and so on, or whether you're meeting certain standards. Now, I know there's a whole discussion about this, which is a very interesting and relevant one. I do actually talk about it in my paper a fair amount. If you look in section 1, you'll see I discuss the base and all various things like that. So I'm going to now move on. I'm going to pass on to John Baker, and the reason I have invited John Baker, and I'm delighted he can participate, and also David Quinn, is that I actually drew a lot from their work. They did a very interesting study, a costing of how universal basic income could work in Ireland, and I drew from that in my paper, and you'll see if you look at the paper how I was able to use the very useful work they did. So John Baker is an emeritus professor in equality studies at University College Dublin, and David Quinn is a Social Democrats councillor in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown Council. Both of them are active members of Basic Income Ireland, and John's going to make some initial comments on the paper, and then David will join in on the questions and answers afterwards. So thanks very much, and over to you, John.
Thanks, Caroline. So I'm going to speak on behalf of Dave Quinn and myself, and both of us will be available for questions. So I thought I might just start by saying that in our model of resourcing basic income, the key point is that we suggest an increased rate of universal social charge at 30% on incomes that are up to 2 times the level of basic income. And that generates quite a high marginal tax rate on low incomes, but the effective rate of tax on low incomes, which is the overall difference between people's pre-tax, pre-transfer income and their post-tax, post-transfer income, is very low. In fact, it's negative for gross incomes up to twice the level of basic income. Now, turning to Caroline's paper, we think that it provides a very interesting and welcome case for basic income. And there are 3 points in the paper that we particularly like to reiterate. First of all, that basic income is a way of providing not just stopgap income, but security of income in a sector where insecurity is common. Secondly, that basic income should be seen as an investment in achieving the kind of economy and society we want, and not just as public expenditure. And thirdly, that it's very important to emphasize the mutual dependence of basic income and the social wage or basic services. And one reason for this is that an adequate basic income is only feasible in an economy that also places limits on the amount of money that people need to spend on essential services, including health, education, childcare, transport, and housing. If those costs are out of control, then the level of basic income needed to cover them also becomes impossibly high. Now, we have a few other comments and questions. First of all, the paper, and this relates to what Caroline just said about CAP. The paper concentrates on caps on farm supports paid through the Common Agricultural Policy, but in many ways, the more relevant comparison for basic income is with the Farm Assist program, which is a means-tested payment that's comparable to job seekers allowance, the same maximum levels of rates of payment and all the complicated conditions about people's incomes and all that. Whereas the phrase basic income in the new CAP basic income support system should really be parsed in a different way. It's not really about anything that we would recognize as basic income. Secondly, that although the two aims of income adequacy and income security are absolutely central to basic income, it's also important to note that overall basic income would generate a more equal distribution of income than the current system. So a wide range of households with lower incomes would be better off financially, and a significant range of households with higher incomes would be worse off financially. A third point relates to the concern that the paper expresses about whether or not basic income could lead to employers offering even lower wages for low-paid work with increasing profits for themselves. That depends a lot on what levels of taxation are leveled on wages. So in the scheme we've put together, as I mentioned before, the marginal rate of tax on low incomes is quite high. So it would be less likely that employers could get away with reducing gross wages and might even have to offer higher gross wages in order to attract workers. And then a final point is that we were just a little bit puzzled by one of the tables in the paper, table 1, which seemed to suggest that disposable incomes for all households would increase in a basic income scenario. And we find that a little bit puzzling because the income tax funding model, anyway, that we've put forward essentially redistributes a relatively fixed total income. So surely total disposable income should be more or less stable, at least before considering the longer term dynamic effects that the paper doesn't address. And that's relevant to the discussion of inflation in the paper, because if total income remains relatively stable, then inflationary pressures are less likely to be uncontainable. So anyway, those are a few comments, and overall we agree that basic income could play an important role in a new model of agriculture. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, John. That's really helpful. And about the table, I'll need to look at that and make sure we're talking about the same thing. I think possibly there's a confusing label for a category or something.
Sure. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Of course, it should be the overall income should be the same, no matter what. So, yeah. So now we have 4 minutes in which we could do, if any of the attendees have a question they'd like to ask or something they'd like to discuss with regard to basic income, this is a good moment if there is anybody who'd like to do that. I'm also going to paste a question in the chat, and this is a question which you can answer in the chat, or if you like, you can put your hand up. So if you'd like to say a word or ask a question, please put your hand up and we'll call on you. Otherwise, we have both John and David Quinn available to answer questions about basic income. So I'm also going to, as I say, post a question in the chat now. So John Russell, there we go. How are you?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. I'm just wondering, are there any current models anywhere of universal basic income in terms of supporting agriculture, or is there anything? I haven't read the paper, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm just wondering, are there any concrete examples at the moment? Is it actually happening anywhere that we could have a look at a model? That's my question.
To the best of my knowledge, there has been trials of a universal basic income in some towns, with diverse employment and so on. But John and David, do you have any knowledge about this, or just in case there's something I don't know?
Well, I mean, there's certainly there, as Caroline mentioned before, the whole idea of a universal basic income is that everyone in the country gets it, and we don't have any examples in the world at the moment where there are countries that have implemented basic income. What we do have is a large number of various pilot schemes that have applied something like a basic income to a select group of people over a period of a couple of years or whatever. The ones that I've heard of that are most relevant to agriculture are actually in low-income countries, where there was a pilot that Caroline mentions in her paper in India of a very small level of universal payment for people in agricultural villages. And those did show interesting effects in terms of how people use the basic income, more for education, for investing in their farms and so on. But we don't, as far as I know, we don't have any examples of pilots in agricultural areas in developed countries.
Thanks, John. Okay, one more question, the last one from Francesca, please.
This question is just for Ollie. I just wanted to ask, I was really interested when you were talking about management schemes that are pulling away from the cap, and I think you gave 2 examples of different countries, but I was just wondering, is there anything like that happening here in Ireland? And I also, if you could clarify for me what the UBI means, because I actually have no idea what that is.
Yeah, I can just maybe mention that the closest thing to progress in Ireland, I suppose, is the new cooperation project areas. So up to 10,000 farmers will receive a payment of about €10,000 to do landscape-based environmental practices, so in specific regions. And that's by European standards, that's progress. It's kind of built on the EIP model, the European Innovation Partnership model, where a specific environmental action will be tried on biodiversity or water or some other like real need. And they're upscaling that to a landscape level. So that's the best thing in there so far. It was England and Germany were trialing systems outside of the sort of cap model at the moment. Britain obviously has left the EU because of Brexit, so there is a new scheme that they're trialing that is based on public goods for public services. Public money for public goods. It's called the environmental and land management schemes. And in Germany, then they're going to trial something that doesn't involve. It's kind of funny. It's like doesn't involve basic payments for farmers. So I know there's controversy over basic income support as a phrase within CAP and the universal basic income as a concept for everyone, but there is that foundational dimension to cap payments for people who own land, and so that's just a.
Thank you. What was it called? The new cooperation program.
Cooperation projects. I'll drop a link into the chat and what page the thing is on about that, because it is probably the best part of the new cap in Ireland.
Thank you. That'd be fantastic.
It encourages farmers to work together like on a landscape level, which is great. Like.
Brilliant.
And both, there's a move in Pillar 2 to move towards payments being results-based, which has come on from the EIPs, where most of the EIPs funding is results-based. So that could influence the area as well.
Yeah, and you can just see, I mean, that's, all these things are very different from universal basic income, which is totally unconditional. You know, you don't have to do anything to your farmland or be agriculturally biodiverse or anything like that in order to get a UBI. Everybody gets it regardless of what they do.
It's sort of equivalent. I mean, a lot of farmers, certainly West Coast farmers, can't exist without having a second income or having a spouse out at work and all that kind of stuff. So there is already within the farming community a split of different kinds of income, which Caroline goes into in the paper. It's quite interesting.
Thanks for that, Charles. Caroline's internet has completely stopped working. So she asked me if I would perhaps ask Colette, maybe, so that we can keep things moving, if Colette could speak her piece now. Is that okay, Colette?
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
No bother at all. You know, I can sing a song, do a dance, whatever you need, Caroline.
Whatever, please do it.
Exactly. So first of all, congratulations to Caroline and to all at Feasta. I'm sure these things, as they are in my own work, tend to be a whole team effort. But it's a fantastic piece of work. So well done to Caroline in particular, but to the whole team. I was delighted to see that site value tax was part of this report and part of its recommendations. And that's, I suppose, the area that I'll be concentrating on. It's one of the recommendations that Social Justice Ireland, my own organisation, would make steadily every budget, every socioeconomic review, every time anybody looks at us, really. And economists love property taxes, mainly because of all the main types of taxes. They're the least distortionary, I suppose. They've the best balance of raising money without interfering in the normal running of the economy. And because land is fixed, I suppose, we're not making any more of it. So no amount of tax will affect the supply of land, unlike how tax can sometimes affect the supply of other things like labor or, you know, consumer goods. And I see that Charles has a piece in the chat about, you know, telling supermarkets that they don't want to buy cheap food. And I think absolutely, you know, we shouldn't be able to buy a chicken for less than €3. In Ireland, though, we do a generally very poor job of taxing land and property. And, you know, it's generally agreed that in the current format, local property tax is quite badly designed, and it's becoming increasingly unfit for purpose. So, you know, we've been quite critical of that from the beginning. And that's, I suppose, it's very interesting to see the proposals in relation to site value tax from an agricultural perspective, because as a born and bred Dub now living in rural Westmeath, it's quite interesting to see that kind of pull between a very kind of urban centric response to a tax like this, and how it might actually benefit and support land use and the agricultural side. But essentially, the site value tax is a tax that's charged on the value of the land, the value of the site, that doesn't take into account anything that's built on it or anything that's been done with it. It's essentially a tax on the unimproved value of the land. And the paper makes a number of arguments in favour of a site value tax. Essentially, they're fairer. Everybody knows that land is worth more in some areas than in other areas, but that rarely has anything to do with anything that developers have done, and more to do with things like National Geographic features or the location or public investment by local authorities in amenities and infrastructure in the surrounding area. So if a land in an area of natural beauty or close to natural amenities would probably be more valuable than if it was further away from these things. So, you know, and again, because of those factors had nothing to do with the actual owner of the land or anything that they've done, they're either a choice or a result of a chance, or the fact that public investment funded by everybody, like a socialized public investment, has been made. so the basic principle of property taxation is that if public investment creates a gain in private value or private wealth, then it's fair to pay for the maintenance of that investment from that private gain of those who have benefited from it. So with that in mind, then a tax based on the value of the land would be reasonable given the benefit that the landowner is getting from investment that's paid by all taxpayers. Land values are very strongly influenced, as I said, by things like infrastructure. And if land has these things, it'll likely be quite valuable. So while it's important to emphasize that land values are generally not influenced by private investment, a landowner might take the lead. And that's the great thing about site value tax, is that it doesn't actually punish owners of land for things that they do, for benefits that they've created and that they've made. It's actually something that might encourage good behavior. And as an example of that, we could consider things like retrofitting. So that's a move, obviously, to make housing more efficient, cheaper to heat, better for the environment. And it's something to be encouraged, particularly under the climate change mitigation plan. Under the current local property tax, a householder who spends money retrofitting their homes and makes it more energy efficient is penalised because that home increases in value. Whereas under a site value tax, that wouldn't be the case, because the value of the land remains the same. So there's no impact on the property tax bill. And essentially what that means is that, that there's an incentive to stop land hoarding. There's an incentive to do works, to improve works. And it's really important when it comes to motivating developers and landowners to develop derelict sites in centres and towns, but also to engage in kind of more green initiatives. Site value taxes can be applied to all types of land, whether it's residential, commercial, public or agricultural. But of course, certain exemptions should be made to make sure that it is fair and that whatever goals we want to achieve can be achieved through this. And I absolutely agree that it is time for site value tax to replace the local property tax. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. So yeah, just thought I'd make it more exciting by disappearing for a minute there. Anyway, that's all. And it's really helpful to have that summary actually about what site value tax is. I'm going to pass on now to Aoife Murphy and Paul Goldrick-Kelly, Kelly from the Nevin Economic Research Institute. So Aoife is an intern at the Nevin Economic Research Institute, and she's the author of the recent paper Risk Issues Within the Agricultural Sector on the Island of Ireland. And Paul is an economist at the Nevin Institute, and his current research interests relate to ecological sustainability and political economy, incorporating issues related to just transition. So thanks very much, Aoife and Paul.
Thanks very much. So I suppose I'll just have to start off by agreeing with Colette and her compliments for the paper. I think it's really interesting and offers really insightful slants on everything that's going on at the moment. So while my background isn't in economics itself, so I don't have a huge amount of familiarity with the hows and whys of why this all works, but the thing that I find most interesting is, I suppose, the concept of using site value tax in conjunction with UBI to potentially encourage rural revitalisation. So I think rural revitalisation is really just such a key element to consider when thinking how we might sustain the Irish agricultural sector and then Irish society as a whole off of the back of that, especially when you consider the high age profile of Irish farmers and maybe the lack of formal succession plans put in place for older farmers as well. I think just the idea that this can kind of create, I suppose, almost like a safety net for people, for young farmers and young people in general to either remain living in rural areas or to migrate to rural areas, and that they feel that there's more opportunity. And so on is just a very key aspect to consider. I thought it was really interesting.
Thank you, Aoife. Paul, have you anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll try and keep my comments brief, not the least because I'm hotspotting at the moment, so having my own technical gremlins here. I'd echo what Aoife said, and I'd actually recommend, if people are interested, to check out Aoife's report on transition issues in the agricultural sector. I think that's kind of underexplored. I suppose in terms of my comments, I'd echo Colette's thoughts around site value tax. It's rare that you come across a tax that kind of meets thresholds, as discussed in the paper, of efficiency, it's equitable, and it doesn't really restrict goods. So in that sense, I welcome that in its discussion with, in conjunction with UBI. It brings to mind, I think there's a former US Treasury Secretary who said a tax system should look as if somebody actually designed it on purpose. So in that sense, it's very good to see a policy initiatives that are linked, that are pulling in the same direction, not pulling in contrary directions, as too often happens in public policy in Ireland. A few kind of errand thoughts in that regard. The revenues cited in the paper are substantial enough, and when we think about the concept of community wealth building, I'm also sort of drawn to think about the underdevelopment of the local government sector in Ireland. Ireland is unusually centralised, in conjunction actually with the UK, unusually centralised in terms of its devolved powers and what local authorities can and can't do in their capacities. Now, one could run in, if the idea was to sort of put site value taxes towards local authorities, you could get the classic American dilemma, wherein high property prices are basically siphoned off by an area, and so perhaps it would be something of a remit from the Exchequer to try and kind of balance these things out. But I wonder if that new pot of money could be sort of deployed within communities in conjunction with that kind of community wealth building program, so that we'd be resourced. Those sort of anchor institutions could start to develop those localized supply chains and everything else. And one other point, in some comparative work that we've done, in comparison to other kind of similarly wealthy countries, Ireland is actually a fairly low revenue country. Now that depends on what sort of item of tax you're looking at. In aggregate, it's quite low, but the taxes that are faced by individual sort of employees are high. Actually, the major gap is in employer PRSI. Our estimates is it's somewhere in the region of 7 to 8 billion euro goes uncollected compared to a comparable state. But also we have significant sort of under taxation in the area of stocks and capital, which sort of site value tax would very well fit into. So I guess now there's the open question of whether other countries do it better, but at least as a sort of demonstration that reform in this direction wouldn't completely, kind of torpedo a society or anything like that. There's a bit of precedent here. It seems that there's substantial space within the Irish sort of exchequer profile to start collecting under something like a site value tax. And perhaps we could look at our balance, because a sort of region in which we over-collect relative to other countries is actually consumption taxes. And we know those tend to be regressive. So some sort of switching of revenues, even staying revenue neutral, if the Irish state decided to switch revenues that it currently gets from the likes of VAT or fuel excise towards site value tax, you might actually get a general progressivity, an increase in the progressivity of the tax system. So those would be some perhaps observations, open questions, maybe to put to the floor.
Thank you, Paul. That's great. I thought that was very interesting what you were saying about having a good balance of taxes. And one of the things that I suggest in the paper, and it's just a suggestion, but I wondered about changing the balance of taxes so that it's easier to hire people or to go into your own business. I'm thinking there, in other words, to shift. I do get what you're saying about consumption taxes being regressive, and I think you're quite right that we need to look at that seriously. But I'm also thinking about the possibility, what I think is quite probable, that with the energy transition and the ecological transition, we're going to see a shift in a need for more labour actually in agriculture, because there'll be fewer fossil fuel inputs and there'll be fewer other ways to power agriculture, as it were. And plus agroecology and organic agriculture are already quite relatively labour intensive. So if there was a way to make it easier to bring on more labour or for people to work on farms, I would see that as a good thing. I'm going to open this up. I don't know if anybody would like to come back on what I just said or what Paul has said, on comment, please feel free to do so. I'm also going to paste a question in the chat again that you can answer either out loud. We have about 3 minutes until the next section, or 4 minutes. So if anybody would like to put their hand up and ask a question or make a comment, please do so. I've just pasted a very broad general question into the comment, which people can answer if they'd like to. So I'm going to open it to the floor for a short while now. Carry on.
Yeah, I just like to, I was particularly interested in Paul. I think it was Paul who mentioned about the lack of resourcing for local decision making and local authorities, and how we don't usually make that connection either with the commons or with local food production or with any of the things that would be dear to environmentalists. I think Ireland is unique in terms of how we are so centralized in terms of how decisions are made and how money is delved out, and we particularly accept that. But I'd love to hear from Paul, you know, is there any way that we can use this crisis in agriculture to turn that around, you know, so this centric approach that we have in Ireland, to give the power to local authorities. And even this whole turf controversy is a real indication of that, about the divide that there is between, if you like, decision making in central government and the perception that that way is, and the reality that local authorities don't have any power.
I was just, thank you for the question. I suppose I'd have to kind of confess my ignorance in the sector, which is actually why I like reading papers like this. I think I'm far too ignorant of sort of agricultural issues specifically. I would say though, look, taking the sort of high level view in the research that we've done, yes, it's one of the most odd things about sort of the structure of Irish public expenditure. Rather than, other than, sort of high level facts around the degree to which we spend on social protection or something like that, is that absence of devolution. So at the very beginning, there's a lot of high level stuff that says, okay, there's a need, particularly if we're talking in climate, there's a need to pull in a common direction, which sort of mandates some sort of, coordination and central direction. But these sort of bespoke solutions that are relevant to a community, and as well, even the sort of political feasibility of that kind of solution requires something of an increase in that kind of localized decision making, both so that the people affected participate and that you get actually a local plan that works, that sort of reflects those kind of local conditions. So I mean, the first basic point would be to the extent to which we don't resource local authorities, we ought to. As I say, the comparative work doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't say that other countries in Europe are ideal. They have their own issues, but at least it's sort of that gap is suggestive of something, I'd sort of suggest. And as I say, I feel, and perhaps it's related to that broad question that was in the chat in terms of rural revitalization. I think giving kind of local authorities that kind of capacity is consistent with, those sort of community wealth building plans. A properly resourced local authority can actually resource, those kind of anchor institutions and expand them and sort of facilitate a kind of virtuous circle upwards for everybody within an area. And I suppose that feeds back into my point being, it's important when we're thinking about these challenges, and I commend the paper for doing that. We're sort of thinking about the property situation in Ireland, but we're also trying to make sure that it isn't at odds with the need to retrofit. We shouldn't have policy addressing two crises working at cross purposes, because basically each sort of avenue, a desired sort of goal, will actually sort of pull against and ensure difficulty in the achievement of the other. And so insofar as we can, we should kind of go for those sort of win-wins. And I think resourcing local authorities might be one of them.
Thanks very much, Paul. And you raise a really excellent point, which is the need for policies to work together and not undermine each other. And that sort of ties in with one of the main messages I was trying to make in the paper, which is the need to break down the silos, to talk across different sectors and bring in different voices from different sectors and make sure we all understand each other and have the same kind of goals, or basically are on the same page, if you like. And that's partly why it's great to have people here from different sectors today as well. So I'm going to move on to the next section of the event, which is about, I'm sorry, Dave, did you have a quick question? It would need to be quick, I'm afraid, but did you want to ask something?
Yeah, just a quick question, if I can, with respect to the site valuation tax. And just wondering if Social Justice Ireland have considered a wealth tax being wider than a site valuation tax, and what benefits that might have with respect to a wider capture of taxation from a wider base. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. And I can see Paul nodding his head because I know Neary have done some work around this area in particular. We have considered it, but given the fact that the vast majority of wealth in Ireland is wrapped up in property, this, I suppose, is probably a move towards a better kind of taxation system that would encompass a real wealth tax. We need better data around wealth. We need better data, through revenue, but also in terms of things like, taxation loopholes. There, again, it comes back to that whole idea of coherence. There are systems that capture data that don't talk to each other, that don't give a full picture of how we might actually achieve something like a comprehensive wealth tax. So I suppose a site value tax would be a step in the right direction, as I say, given the fact that there's so much wealth wrapped up in property.
Great, thanks, Colette. Yeah, I would echo what she just said as well. So now I'm going to move on to the final segment, which is about debt. And again, I'll very, very quickly explain. In my paper, I give a little overview of the situation at the moment with debt. There's an enormous amount of debt concerning housing, particularly in Ireland, and also to a certain extent concerning, since this is a paper on agriculture, about farm business. There's a certain amount of debt there. The farm business debt is mostly concentrated in one sector, mostly the more high input like dairying, to a certain extent tillage. And we're very pleased to have somebody here today, Gary Digney, who's a specialist in helping farmers who run into difficulties with paying their debts. And just one last broad point about the paper, one of the points I'm making is that I think there is actually a crisis overall in debt. I think things like housing and to an extent farmland have become over commodified, and we have to figure out ways to deflate that and to make debt much more sustainable in a way that's fair to everyone. And that's the challenge. It has to be fair both to the debtor and to, for example, savers whose pensions might be invested in various things and so on. So it's a challenge, but I think it's a really important part of the transition. So I'm going to hand over to Gary Digney. And Gary Digney is the Restructuring Recovery Director at PKF FPM Accountancy, and he's a chartered accountant, a licensed insolvency and personal insolvency practitioner, and he advises farmers who are encountering difficulties in repaying farm business related debt and who are facing the potential loss of their farmland. So thanks very much, Gary. I'll pass over to you now.
Morning, everyone. Charlie, thanks very much, and thanks for the invite, and congratulations on a very interesting paper. I have to say, I really enjoyed reading it. Just in terms of the debt section, I suppose it's very hard to summarize this in 5 minutes, but I give it a go. Debt in Ireland, particularly personal debt, to be honest, the regime was very, very draconian. It was so far behind, the United Kingdom and other European countries. Effectively, 5 years ago, if you had personal debt in Ireland, you only really had one option, which was bankruptcy. And bankruptcy was extremely onerous. It was a 12-year process. It was very expensive to bankrupt someone, and therefore there was very few of them. And really, you only ever seen high net worth guys being made bankrupt. And so the government really changed the legislation, and it was probably forced on them due to effectively investment funds coming into the country after the financial crash, because obviously the country needed liquidity. These funds come in, but there was legislation required then in order to protect the people. So Ireland went from a very draconian, not a lot of options process to actually one of the most fluid and forward-thinking ones in the world. And obviously that had its opportunities and it also had its drawbacks. So yeah, I'm from a farming background myself, and rightly or wrongly, I could see a big problem for farmers in the sense of, you know, farmers' loans, because of the ECB pressure to leverage the Irish banks, they were forced to sell loans. And the so-called investment funds have a short-term business model. They will buy at X and they will sell at X plus 10. And the problem for the farmer was their loan would have been sold, but they've got a lovely big asset that could be realized to pay that loan at a profit. And the investment funds aren't like the traditional Irish banks, where we all know in agriculture, there's bumps in the road. It's very secular. You know, you could ring the bank and say, listen, I can't afford to make this month's payment. Could you give me the next month? None of that exists with the vulture funds. And what you're starting to see, and I have been seeing this last number of years, is they are aggressively pursuing the land and putting them up for sale. So the government introduced legislation in 2012, which only really became active in 2015. It's called a personal insolvency arrangement. And what it was done, it was introduced to protect people's home houses. So if your home mortgage was sold to an investment fund, you could enter into one of these arrangements, and effectively it will have the following effect. One, you could write the debt down, right size it to the market value of your asset. So for example, if you had a home house that was worth now 200,000 euros, but you had a debt of 400,000, you could enter into one of these arrangements and right size that mortgage from 400 down to 200. And it allowed you to keep your house. You could also then extend the loan over a period of time that is sustainable and affordable to the homeowner. And you could also, believe it or not, reduce the interest rate to a market rate. So the idea was this legislation would allow you to retain your home house, but on a sustainable, affordable basis. Now, in Ireland, it's very difficult to repossess a home house. Not impossible, but very difficult. It's not very difficult to repossess and sell farmland. So what myself and a few others done is we took that legislation and we applied it to farmers. And thankfully, it was passed in both courts. It's now something that's readily used by farmers. And there is a lot of farm debt. A lot of farmers, there's a lot of debt out there. There's a lot less banks now, with Ulster Bank pulling out of the market and KBC. It's a lot harder to get rebanked. And quite often these loans will end up in the hands of investment funds. And the investment funds really will not entertain a long-term strategy. And these personal insolvency arrangements are a mechanism to allow the farmer to retain the land and stretch the loan out over a sustainable period of time.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks, Gary. That's very interesting, thanks. I'm going to pass on now to Bridget Murphy, who's the final person who's going to speak about the paper. Bridget is a land and human rights lawyer turned farmer based in Sligo, who's the project manager of the agroecological farming organisation Talamh Bao's Soil Biodiversity Literacy and Enhancement Environmental Innovation Project. And her focus includes differing forms of land use, tenure and management, and the role of women in farming. So Bridget, thanks very much. On to you.
Thanks, Caroline. I hope the sound is right. You know, when I started reading your paper, and I was thinking if I was just going to be commenting on point 3, you know, housing and debt, whether I'd have a lot to say. And at this stage, you're going to have to kind of rein me back in again, because it's amazing how much kind of started coming out around this. But let's have a look at some of these observations around dealing with debt and agricultural debt and housing. So, you know, first of all, I think that when we're looking at kind of the whole issue of debt around agriculture, we have to acknowledge that we're pursuing a not fit for purpose model of agriculture, and the sectors that we're putting the investment in aren't the best ones at the moment. Your dominant narrative is measuring ag's contribution to things by its economic contribution to GDP, or by the number of jobs it creates, or, you know, as people usually just say, it's great contribution to the rural economy. But how and what we do this to deliver this GDP contribution is, as I say, well, as people have been mentioning, it's really built on a lot of unsustainable externalities, your impact on the environment, the impact on communities, and the impact on a whole cohort of farmers. And that leads on to a second point of mine. We always kind of just talk about farmers. I'm hearing people, you know, I'm a farmer, or I'd speak to farmers, or we farmers are not a homogenous bunch. And quite honestly, we have to acknowledge that, especially when it comes to the resources that fund how and what we do in agriculture, it's been geared towards giving towards the system that works off Ireland does what's best. I mean, what Ireland does best is growing grass, and that translates to the only kind of markets we have that are worth pursuing would be dairy and beef. And I do think we need to challenge that idea and move beyond that, especially when so many ecosystems that farmers work off of are not conducive to turning it into grazing platforms. And I'm specifically talking here about things like the hills, your peatlands, your wetlands, clay areas, Leitrim, look at it with your drumlin. It's not actually geared towards the dominant narrative that grass is what we do best. But in terms of just looking at that thing of what is fit for purpose, I mean, I think that we need, and Seán was talking about it earlier on, you know, we've got this almost perfect storm of challenges and things that are going down at the moment. And if you look at what would be fit for purpose, we would need to meet a lot of basic needs. We would need to be providing food, which is local, nutrient dense, chemical free, on short supply chains. We need to look at housing that's appropriate. And I mean, I think the mica blocks are a perfect example of what happens when you go and build something on really kind of sketchy, not foundations, materials. And I do think that there's, funnily enough, a metaphor to run through this as we build forward, as we build into the CAP, as we build into these new agricultural diversifications, etc. We do need to make sure that they're solid and they aren't going to crumble on us in coming decades. In terms of housing, you know, we need to kind of provide housing, but we need to be way more creative about how and what that housing is going to look like, whether we start using materials like hemp and glulam and different types of wood products. And then the same thing where we're talking about jobs, those jobs need to be about going back to the land, about renaturing Ireland, and that is something that needs to be paid for, something that's always been taken for granted, that farmers just do that. But where farmers have had to leave the farms to go and get a second job so that they can survive, often that's what gets cut out. So as I say, I mean, we need to challenge the fact that Ireland grows grass best, so that's what our ag gets built on. We need to challenge the fact that dairy is the most sustainable. And I'm going to say perhaps it is the most sustainable only because it's been made the most sustainable. It's where the most grants are given. It's where the most opportunities are given. It's where the most support is given. we're doing a lot of kind of like our agriculture around the fact that this is science, technology, innovation, academic. We viewing nature as a platform. Our land is a grazing platform. Our animals are economic units. We have this high external input agriculture, and we need to really shift away to this low external input model. As I say, we're gearing all the money and support to that high external economic input model. I'm just going to jump through some of the other stuff here. Okay, dairy being made profitable. We need to move away from the Pareto principle that underpins so much of agroecology, the 80-20 rule. 80% of results come from 20% of your inputs or causes. And quite honestly, as I say, it's propping up a system of dairy and beef, and where the real opportunities are, which are smaller farms, diversification opportunities, those cannot come into focus because there is no funding or resources attached to it. There's just a lot of talk, but absolutely no physical supports coming in. We need to stick to the polluter pays principle, stop funding the practices. If you have a look, 6 out of 10 of your dairy farmers are in debt versus 3 out of 10 of your beef and your tillage. And it's actually because the beef and the tillage people can't get, or not so much the tillage, but the beef and the sheep and the smaller family farm, they actually can't get into debt because they can't access the credit. So again, following money, let's have a look and see where the money lands. At the moment, the money's landing in the fertilizer companies, the big machinery companies, the seed companies, the pesticide companies. If we want that money to land up in the hands of people and communities, then we need to redesign how we actually kind of like parceling it out. I suppose the last thing I'd like to say is maybe instead of shifting the goalposts, that we need to look at a whole new playbook. Because the pitch has changed, the game has changed, and we need a whole new set of kind of rules and approaches as opposed to maybe just shifting the goalposts.
That's a great point. Thanks, Bridget. In fact, I became increasingly ambivalent about the title of this paper as I worked on it, because it felt like the goalposts were shifting up all by themselves all the time. New things kept coming up, and I was trying to incorporate them in, and it was just quite a task. But those are all very interesting points, and very important also about diversification and the power imbalances and who's getting the money. And one of the points that I make in my paper actually is the need for more what I call values-based finance, the need to have stakeholder community banking that's, in public banking, mutual banking, models of banking that help people who need to have credit, who are doing good stuff on the ground, to get access to credit. So that's really, really vital. So we have 5 minutes left. We're going to wrap up in a minute. I do have a final question for the attendees. I'm going to paste it into the chat. And I also wanted to mention that there's going to be a follow-up event, which is going to be on May 18th in the evening. It's part of National Biodiversity Week. And I'm going to be adding a bit to this paper, amending it in some ways based on what I've learned today. And I'm going to do a little bit more of a structured presentation of the paper at that event. And then there'll be a more open dialogue with people in the audience. If there's a lot of people, we might do breakout rooms. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, I've just posted the link for that in the chat here. And another thing somebody has asked me to point out is that you might know already, but you can save the chat from this event if you're interested in keeping it. If you click on the 3 dots on the lower right at the bottom there, if you'd like to save it, because I know there's been a lot of very interesting comments made. So now I'm going to do this. This is the first time I've ever done this. I'm going to try using Mentimeter for a minute. So Mentimeter is a kind of a useful thing where you can post questions and everybody can see what's being said in the questions on the screen immediately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the link. Here it is, and I'm going to post it into the chat. And if you could click on that link, please, and then I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you will see the answers. Now, while this is all going on, I'm also going to ask our final speaker, who is Aoife Pocock, just to say just a very quick impression of the event for her. Aoife is a media and communication professional who lives in Cloughjordan, and I just asked her to give a personal response. This isn't going to be a summing up, it's just a personal response.
So I'd just like to say I'm glad you didn't ask me to do a summary of all that was said, because that would have been extremely challenging given the level of expertise and thought that everybody had put into their response to your paper, Caroline. But I suppose what I would like to say is that I think what you have designed and provided us with here today is a really excellent example of how to do a really great event. It was underpinned by your paper, which was justifiably applauded and welcomed by the speakers. I really love the way that you offered your paper, and then you basically asked for feedback in public, rather than asking for feedback coming directly into you, and that you presented that at the end, your final polished product, as it were. So I think that's a really, really lovely model, a really participative model. So I think if one of your aims of this event was to break down silos, the way that you have designed it has really done that. I noted the number of times the contributors, who are all clearly extremely expert in their different areas, said, I don't know about that area. So I think that's that in those comments accentuate what you have achieved here today. The other thing that struck me was that the two main themes, or the three themes that you mentioned in your paper, and a lot of the discussion today, are about issues of justice, across society, not just about agriculture. And that's just something that struck me, that UBI and site value. It struck me that these are the things that you're bringing to a conversation about rural lives and agriculture. And you would say possibly initially, well, what have they got to do with agriculture? So I think that was really exciting, as for a kind of an non-academic, and from a non-policy making point of view. They're very easily communicated, these ideas. And I love the idea of a site value tax. It's something that struck me many years ago as something quite easy to understand. And so it's great to hear it being brought in into this discussion. One thing I would say, I'm not a big fan of asking people to interact in the chat when people are speaking, because I think there's so much great stuff being brought, and I think we live in such a distracted world. It would be great to say, okay, we've all got to focus on who's speaking now, and then maybe have a kind of a chat storm afterwards. It's just one suggestion, but it's great. I didn't know that you could now, as individual participants, save the chat, so that's really great. And I think it's super that you're doing a follow-up event, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I just like to congratulate everybody, and a big boulabus for Caroline and the team. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Aoife. And that's a great wrapping up we've done there. I'm going to just pass over to Seán, who's going to say goodbye. And just before I do that, thanks very much again, everyone, for listening in. I appreciate your input. And over to Seán, who's going to wrap up.
Great. Thanks very much, Caroline. And thanks, Aoife. I just want to reiterate what she was saying about thanks to everybody for coming along. For staying to the end. I know some people had to go, and particularly thanks to the speakers. Very frustrating, I'm sure, because most of you had an awful lot to say and it was a very restricted time. But I particularly want to thank Caroline. I think she's managed to pull off something which is pretty much impossible, but I think it was very, very rich and very worthwhile doing what we tried to do. I always like to finish on something like a bit of arty, or make us think a little bit differently. And I was thinking of even a couple of lines of poetry. I wasn't going to sing a song, but and I was saying, what would I do? And then it immediately jumped at me, the word Feasta that most Irish people learn in school from the poem Kilcash. Is really, really relevant, and the lines from the poem are so relevant today. For those who are not Irish speakers or haven't learned the poem, the word Feasta is a kind of an enigmatic term. It really means from now on, or henceforth, or You know, we're at a stage where we need to look forward in some way. We're coming from the past into the future. And the poem that it's taken from, it's Kilcash, and it's allegorical in the sense. Kilcash is down here where Charles Stanley Smith is coming from. But it's allegorical because it's saying the old ways are gone and we have to go in with new steps into the future. But it links into trees and forests. Cadayenamid Feasta gan aimad, ta deran na gailte lár. So the forests are finished. And what are we going to do without wood? That's what the poem says, but it doesn't really mean that. And I think it's particularly appropriate, as we didn't talk about forestry at all in today's discussion, but the department is working hard on a new vision for forestry. And I don't think they're looking at that poem at all, but allegorically what we're looking for is not just new agriculture, but we're looking at new ways of living and new life. And therefore, just Cadayenamid Feasta is really the way we should look upon this morning. What are we going to do from now on? How can we create a totally new form of well-being, an imaginary of well-being in the country? So I'd like to finish on that note and thank everybody for being there. Please feel free to contribute after the event. You know, you can send in further emails or whatever to Caroline or Morag. I think you all have the address thing. So slán abhaile, good luck to you.